Hello, and welcome to another episode of Peter Herman Adventures. It's the beginning of December here on the Vedder River, and there's a little bit of steelhead fever in the air. So the plan today is to film a small introduction to steelhead fishing for you guys. I'm going to make a few casts just so I don't stand here like a statue boring you guys to death, and I'm going to chat about steelheading while I do it. I'm going to cover a few different things. I'm going to chat about river etiquette. That's kind of specific to steelhead season. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about fish handling, which is also kind of special for these Vedder River steelhead. And I'm going to tell you guys about the gear. I'm going to tell you guys about how hard or easy it is to catch a steelhead. And I'm going to talk about the run timing and run size, and I'm also going to go over a little bit of gear. Now the thing is, to go over everything really requires a series of videos, so this will be kind of a very basic introduction, because to go over everything, this video would have to be like 2 hours long, and I don't think anybody wants to sit through that. Just wanted to do a little shout out to all the people that have been coming up to me along the river and saying hi and telling me that they enjoy my videos. I really appreciate that. It makes me motivated to keep putting these ones out there. And so thank you everybody who said hi, and don't be shy. I'm quite approachable and always happy to meet new people on the river and give out some advice and tips and the occasional free lure if you're running low. So yeah, let's go right into steelhead fishing. The regulations for steelhead fishing are not that complicated. You're allowed one hatchery steelhead per day, and all the other steelhead have to be released. You have to have a tag or a conservation stamp to fish for steelhead. And while there are steelhead in the river, you actually need a conservation stamp just to fish the river. You can't just say, oh, I wasn't after steelhead, I was just after little trout. To fish here during steelhead season, you need to have that tag on your license. And it's money well spent. I think that conservation money stays, it really is a conservation stamp. The money raised from the sales of those goes towards salmon habitat enhancement and running hatcheries and all that other stuff that it takes to keep this fishery going. So yeah, buy your stamp and come out here and try and catch a steelhead. Let's start out with the fishing etiquette. During salmon season, there are a lot of people on the Vedder. It's probably the most heavily pressured river system in British Columbia, and the normal etiquette is, if you leave the next angler enough room for a decent, comfortable cast, then you're just gonna, slot in, stand there and fish, and that's okay. So, during salmon season, if you're, say, like a rod length and a little bit away from the next angler, that's fine, and that's considered acceptable. There really is more fish than shoreline along the river. Oh, I goobered that, didn't I? There's more available fish than available fishing shoreline, so people do have to crowd in a little bit. It's different during steelhead season. The river's still busy. On a weekend, you still have, I would say, maybe like 500 or 600 people that come out to the Vedder to chase steelhead every weekend. It's still quite busy, but the way that people fish steelhead is not like fishing salmon. You don't just park yourself in one spot and fish away for the whole day and let the fish come to you. The way most people fish for steelhead is they fish through a mile or two or a couple of kilometers of river. And so you start at the top of a run. And for those of you that don't know, a run is just a section of river where it slows down a little bit between two sets of rapids. You start at the top of the run, you start fishing there, and with every cast you take a step or two down river until you fished it right down to the tail out. The tail out is just the shallow part right at the end of a run. And so it's considered really poor etiquette to low hole somebody. And low holing is when you show up to a run and there's somebody who's already fishing that run and you start fishing downstream from them. So that person is fishing the run by taking a step or two down every cast. Then if you start fishing below them, it would be kind of like cutting in line at the supermarket. Like when you're standing there to go through the checkout and somebody cuts in front of you, that's considered very rude. Starting downstream from somebody who's steelhead fishing is exactly the same thing. So even if it's a big run and there aren't any people there, you would think it would be fine to start 100 feet or 200 feet down from the next guy. But the polite thing is if they've just started fishing the run, then you wait a few minutes until they've moved down and you start fishing that run above them and you follow them down the run. So it's kind of like when you show up to the river, you show up to a run, you've got your spot in line, and then you rotate down. Now if you want to fish that run again, then you just walk back up to the top and start fishing that run again. So that kind of covers the etiquette. Low holing, that's the big one. If you low hole somebody, you've immediately pegged yourself as either a complete rookie or a jerk. And you can pretty much forget about getting any advice from that fisherman who maybe has a lot more experience than you do. Enough about etiquette, let's talk about fish handling. These steelhead, they're a big and tough fish, but fish in general are kind of fragile creatures. And unlike a salmon that's going to be dead in 2 or 3 weeks anyway, these steelhead return to the river year after year. Some of them return 3 or 4 times to the river before they finally die. And so they need to be treated with a lot more care and respect. The wild ones that are to be released, really they should be played quickly and they should be landed gently. So those fish that are wild fish, they should never touch any rocks. You shouldn't handle them with gloves on. And really, they should stay wet the whole time. Like that fish that you've had on the line for 5 or 10 minutes has just been through a fight for its life. It's put all its energy, it's consumed. Like when they finally give up, they give up because their muscles are out of oxygen. And if you've just fought them into shore, finally tailed them, and then you go and lift them out of the water for a couple of pictures and a short video with your buddies, that fish, it's like running a 100-meter sprint and then somebody puts a hand over your mouth and doesn't let you breathe. Like you really have to keep those fish and keep them breathing and keep them in the water so that they have a little chance to recover. And after they've had a minute or two to breathe and recover and calm down a little bit, then you can take them out of the water for like a 2-3 second picture, put them back in, release them. Just every wild steelhead in this system is precious. And I would say every wild steelhead in this system is going to get caught once or twice or maybe several times on their way up to spawn. And if they get mishandled once, they'll probably survive. If they get mishandled 2 or 3 times, they won't spawn. And worst case, they'll just die. And we don't want that. We want this fishery to be sustainable, even though there's a really heavy pressure on this run of fish. So treat them, really baby them. I carry a net, and that's probably the best way to handle them. When you can land a fish quickly without completely exhausting them, you scoop them up in the net while they're still kind of struggling, then you don't even have to handle them. You don't have to squeeze their tail and take their slime coat. If you have a soft rubberized net, you can land them quickly and release them quickly with minimal handling. You can take your pictures with the fish in the net, and really I think that's the best way to handle the fish. Don't take them out of the water, just land them quickly in a net. And realistically, you're going to land more fish if you have a landing net. At least 10% of the fish get off while you're struggling with them in shallow water, trying to get them to shore, trying to get them to identify them. Okay, is this a wild? Is this a hatchery? Can I keep it? Can I not? There's that moment there. A lot of fish just kind of flop around. They give one last little burst and they're gone. Where if you had a net along, they would already be in the net. So that's enough about fish handling. Let's get into the likelihood of you catching a steelhead. I'm not some sort of great steelhead fisherman, I'll tell you that flat out. I've been fishing for steelhead for 2 years. I've made good use of those 2 years. I've talked to a lot of different people along the river, and I've gotten a lot of great advice. Probably the best advice I've gotten so far was from Nick down at Chilliwack Dart and Tackle. He's the owner of that local Chilliwack tackle store there. And when I was sort of, getting my first bits of information together about how the heck do I catch a steelhead, he told me, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, is, well, there aren't many steelheads, so if you really want one, you have to get out there and you have to fish for them. And you have to go out lots. And that, still to this day, that's the best advice. Like, you can talk about different kinds of gear and technique and different spots and different water. There's no right or wrong, it's all just kind of debate. The best advice is, if you want a steelhead, you got to put in your time. You have to get out there. You have to get to know the river. You have to get to know where the fish are hanging out, and eventually you'll get one. So in my 2 years, and this is kind of stuff that, I don't think too many people share that out there on YouTube or on the internet, is how much they actually catch. When you look at Facebook, all you see is people landing fish, and when you look at YouTube videos, you just see people, catching fish, and they're editing out those long hours of casting that it took to get that fish. So you kind of get this feeling that, this can't be that bad, it can't be that hard, there's lots of fish out there. But really, there aren't a lot of fish out there. The Chilliwack River Hatchery produces about 100,000 steelhead smolts every year, and out of those they get about a 2% return. So every year on the Vedder, approximately 2,000 hatchery steelhead return to the system. I'm not sure how many wild steelhead return. My guess it would be probably around the 5,000 mark, something like that. I haven't read any statistics, I'm just totally guessing. So that's 2,000 hatchery fish that come in over a period of approximately 3 months. So on any given day in the river, let's say they're half of that, there's 1,000 hatchery fish out there. Well, there are probably more than 2,000 fishermen that come to this river to try and get a steelhead. So it's less than one fish per person. So anyway, back to my original point. I'm going to tell you exactly how many steelhead I've caught. I've been chasing them for 2 years, and I've landed 6 fish. So throughout the 2 years, my average has been almost identical. It takes me about 10 to 15 trips to the river to catch a steelhead. So I'm not talking about all-day fishing expeditions. I live 2 minutes from the river. So I often pop out for an hour after work, sometimes an hour before work. Sometimes it's like this, just a little Sunday afternoon, little fish. I showed up here about 3:30. I'm going to fish till 4:30, and then I'm going home. So I would say for each steelhead that I've caught, I've put in roughly 16 hours of fishing. It's quite a bit of time to catch one fish. To catch coho, it usually takes me 2 to 3 hours of fishing effort for each coho that I catch. So they are really a fish of 1,000 casts. If you think you're maybe doing 100 casts an hour times 15 hours for each fish, that's 1,500 casts for every steelhead that I've landed. There are definitely guys that outfish me on the river for steelhead by a long shot. There are guys out here who can, and by guys I mean guys and girls, lots of great female anglers on this river or any other river. I'm not being sexist in any way here. There are definitely people who can show up and they can catch a steelhead pretty much every time they go out. But usually they've had 15 or 20 years of experience, or they've learned from somebody who's got 15 or 20 years of experience and kind of stood on their shoulders a little bit. So that's it. Yeah, I mean, I don't go out. I go out maybe twice a week during steelhead season, and that's spread out over 3 months. So if you want to look at it another way, it's not just 15 hours and you got yourself a steelhead. For me, it's like a month of fishing, sporadic little trips for each steelhead. And I really have mixed feelings about the whole steelheading thing, because ethically, I'm more of a food fisherman. I don't think that wild creatures were put on this earth to be played with by us. It's very exciting to catch a steelhead. When you've put in that much time to catch a steelhead, it's a huge rush. Like, after I land a steelhead, my hands are shaking, and they're shaking for like a half an hour. It is a tremendous rush when you put in that much effort to catch a fish, to finally get one, hatchery or not. It feels awesome. And I think that's that kind of addiction that keeps people coming back. And so the ethical part for me is like, okay, I don't want to be playing for these fish with these wild creatures just for my enjoyment, but it is enjoyable. So if there weren't any hatchery fish in here to catch, I wouldn't be out here. I just, that's where I draw the line. If there is no retention in a system, you will not see me fishing it. But out of the steelhead I've caught, my first year, 2 were hatchery and 1 was wild. I thought, yeah, that's cool. That's good. I can live with those odds. But then last year, I fished all season and I got 3 wild steelhead, so no retainable fish at all. And then I'm kind of, thinking about it. It's like, well, is this fishery for me? Like, is it okay to be dragging these wild steelhead out of the river just for my enjoyment? And the jury's still out on that. We'll see how this season goes. If it's a repeat and I go a 3rd year and I keep catching wild steelhead, I don't know if I'm going to be returning to it. I might just stick to the salmon. I'll let you know how it goes at the end of the season. So yeah, we've covered a lot of the basics about, okay, how frequently can you expect to catch one? Certainly some people go an entire season without catching any, and then some people catch a beautiful big hatchery steelhead the first time to the river. You never know. I started steelheading because a couple of years ago, well, 3 years ago, my daughter around Christmas, she said, well, Daddy, what's in the river right now? What's running? And she's 10 years old, and I said, well, it's steelhead, but they're like unicorns. Nobody's sure if they really exist. And she's like, well, let's go catch one. And so I bought a tag and we went out, and her second time to the river, she had a fish on. She lost it. She didn't land it, but second time out, she had one on. It took me about my first steelhead, I don't know, probably 10 or 12 trips to the river, and I landed a small wild doe. So that's what keeps it exciting. Every cast could be it. And you never know, it could be your first trip, it could be your 50th. That's what keeps it exciting. So where was I? Yeah, run timing. It's early December and there are some steelhead in the river. But on any given day, I would say there are more anglers chasing these fish than there are steelhead in the river. Right now, it's the first few fish that are coming up. And some of them actually, they'll come up the river, realize the party's not on yet, and they'll head back out to the Fraser, even out to the ocean, and then come back up in a couple of weeks. That's what they call staging. It's kind of a scouting mission for these fish. They take a quick trip up the river, they go back out, they come in again. I don't know. Nobody really knows. Well, maybe some fisheries guys know, but my guess would be early December. There are definitely less than 100 steelhead in the river right now. Maybe just 20. You kind of have to only go by what gets caught and when. And I go by the statistics on the Wally Hall Memorial Derby, and that's the fishing efforts of roughly 400 to 500 people every year kind of get reflected in that running tally. And the last couple of years, the first hatchery fish was weighed in mid-December. Then you have another derby, the Boxing Day Derby, put on by the Fish and Game Club. Same thing, it's about 400 or 500 people that entered that. Last year, out of those 400 or 500 people, there was one fish weighed in. So in December, there are fish in here, but they're rare, they're hard to find, and you're really looking for a needle in a haystack. It isn't really until about mid-January that they show up in some sort of significant numbers, and then the run continues to strengthen until kind of February, March. I would say maybe by the end of March, most of the fish that will come up the river have come up, and they hang around for about a month. And in April, May, some of them are already spawned and they're starting to head back out. So that's kind of the run timing. It's spread out over a long period of time, and there's this huge rush on the river in December. Like, people get all excited, let's go out, let's catch one. And it's not wasted time. You get familiar with the river, you get you get to know the runs, you get to know the depths, so that when you show up, you already know what you're going to be fishing and where and when. It's not wasted time, it's a good scouting time, but your chances of landing a steelhead in December are pretty darn slim. If you're driving from far away, like from Vancouver or Delta or wherever, and you want to have a really good chance of actually catching a steelhead while you're out, I would say focus your efforts on February or March. And people get all obsessed about where to fish. I think that's a misplaced obsession. It really doesn't matter where you go. It's the different parts of the river all hold fish, and they're just a little bit different. Like the canal and the lower part of the river, the fish are just passing through there, so they're traveling fish. So you always keep getting new fish, and you're getting fish that they're really nice and chrome, they're fresh, they have a lot of fight in them, and they also haven't seen a lot of gear. They haven't had hundreds of fishing gear presentations floating past them, so maybe they're a little bit more aggressive about the catching, about biting, but they're just passing through. And they don't hang out very long. When you go to the middle or the upper river, those fish are kind of more staying put, and it's easier to identify the spots where they've holed up. Like, they travel up in shallow water, but they like to rest in deep water, because at that time of year that they're in the river, there's nothing else. There aren't hundreds of salmon to distract the predators up there. Bears and eagles and fishermen, and so they don't feel safe really like hanging out in the shallow water. Not like coho. Coho, you show up in the morning, they'll be in a foot of water, maybe 2 feet of water. The steelhead, they hug the banks to travel up the river, but they like to rest more in the slower, deeper sections. So on the upper, you're going to find resting fish. In the lower, you're going to find traveling fish. But really, there are fish everywhere. You just have to learn how to catch them in your own particular favorite spot. And, how to go after them? That's a tricky subject. I don't know if I should even be giving out advice on how to catch steelhead per se, like what works best. I've watched lots of videos. I've talked to probably 100 people on the river about how they do it. And I've kind of settled on my technique that works for me. I use a clear drift chartreuse float. I use usually a 25, maybe a 30 on, these are all floats that I found on the river, so I'm not too picky about the size. I use a clear drift anyway, so because when you look at it from underneath, I don't know if you can see from underneath the float, they really kind of disappear against the white sky. And I use 3 egg weights because I find that they sink really quickly. Then I use a slightly longer leader than I would for salmon. I use about 2.5 feet. For salmon, it would be more like 1.5 feet, maybe 2. That's because the steelhead, unlike salmon, the steelhead are actually feeding in the river. So when they grab something, they actually mean to eat it and swallow it. So salmon will just grab something and then they let it go right away. The steelhead, they'll grab it and they'll eat it. So you have a little bit more time to set the hook. You see your float go down, you set the hook. And on the end of the hook, I have a small piece of shrimp. So these are just regular raw shrimp from the store. And I've put a little bit of wizard egg cure. So any kind of roe cure that you buy from the store. It has a lot of food coloring in it, and I just add a little bit of that, a little sprinkling of that to the Ziploc that I carry my shrimp around in. And this is about the biggest sort of piece I would put on. Sometimes I use much smaller. And what I like about shrimp is that they'll take that kind of throughout the whole season. Sometimes I switch it up and I put on roe bags or even loose roe. I've been told over and over that steelhead roe is the best thing, but you got to catch a steelhead to get steelhead roe. So that's not always easy to come by. I go with shrimp. It's easy. It's relatively cheap. Like 2 or 3 shrimp will last me for a couple of hours of fishing. It's not really a lot of money invested. And usually I fish with a pretty small piece. And then if I get a bite, then I'll put on a bigger piece and try that spot again. Quite often, out of steelhead, you'll get more than 1 bite. So if the first one you miss, or you forget to set your hook, or you spit it, the hook spits. Oh man, I've talked too much. If the fish spits the hook the first time, let him rest for a few minutes and then cast again with the same presentation, same spot, and quite often that fish will bite again. Most of the fish I've got this year was on the 2nd bite or the 3rd bite that I've drifted by them. So that's about it. I use shrimp, but there are many different ways to catch them. In the early season, in December and January, their primary food sources are roe that's floating down the river. They will actually even nose in the gravel. Like the steelhead will dig in the gravel. You can see their noses are kind of beat up a little bit in search of roe. So that's something that they're actively feeding on. So fishing single beads or fishing roe is imitating something that they would naturally be eating in the early season. The other thing they eat are chunks of salmon meat. So they're dying and rotting salmon in the river, and that meat is falling apart and it smells gross to us, but the fish eat it. It's a little bit of nutrition in it. So you can imitate that with bits of white wool or small white jigs or white fluffy flies. There's a number of ways you can imitate chunks of salmon meat. And so those things work really well in the early season. In the later season, I'm talking springtime, when the leaves start to green up on the trees, there will be a lot of salmon fry in the river. So any kind of small fish imitation starts to become more productive than floating roe or floating salmon meat imitations. So, you know, that time of year, they bite well on Colorados, little tiny spoons, small spinners, any kind of fish imitation. But really you know, like I said, I don't know, I haven't got that all figured out. When you're only getting a bite once every 10 hours of fishing, it's really difficult to quantify. It's like, okay, this is really working and this isn't working, because for me, most of the time, nothing's working. So I just keep trying. Yeah, well, that's about it. This video is getting super long. I've talked for half an hour already, and if you're still watching, congratulations. Really, I don't think anybody makes it this far to the end of the video. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate all your support and all the people that have subscribed to my channel. Thank you. And leave a comment if you want to know anything about salmon fishing or steelhead fishing on the Vedder. I'd be more than happy to answer your comments. If you have video suggestions for future, then send those my way and I'll see if I can make something happen for you. Thanks for watching. See you next time.